before I do so, I'll give you a bit of background on how this panel developed. For Douglas's centennial year, Dr. Susan Martin was selected as the Blanche, Edith, and Irving Laurie New Jersey Chair in Women's Studies. The Laurie Chair brings cutting-edge scholars and practitioners to campus for 1 to 2 week residencies to share research, give a public lecture, and interact with students and faculty associated with Douglas Residential College, the Department of Women's and Gender Studies, and the Institute for Women's Leadership. An alumna of Douglas and a renowned scholar and policymaker for national and international governments and organizations on the issues of migration, immigration, and the challenges refugees face, Dr. Martin embodies Douglas's continued achievement in rigorous scholarship and service. She was the perfect fit to lead a group of emerging scholars as they explored these issues. As the Laurie Chair, Dr. Martin taught a year-long course entitled Women in Displacement that focused on the causes and consequences of forced migration and specifically on their impact on women and girls. This course fulfilled the core mission of Douglas, to provide an intellectual community to inspire women to learn, lead, and live with conviction, creativity, and critical thinking. Dr. Martin also guided the students in networking with other renowned scholars, advocates, and policymakers working on this issue. Building on connections they made during a field trip in October and at Rutgers, the Laurie Chair scholars reached out to today's distinguished guests. This panel and a panel this afternoon are the results of these efforts. Please join me in applauding Dr. Martin, her graduate assistant Anna Zal, and the Laurie Chair scholars, Nana Adu, Talia Bassett, Lorraine Delaney, Hayin Blue, Sarah Pomerant, and Hillel Yadin. Now I'm pleased to introduce our distinguished panelists and tell you a bit about the organizations they represent. We are pleased to welcome Dr. Electra Kostopol, an instructor in the History Department and Program in Modern Greek Studies at Rutgers University. Her research and publications have to do with comparative empires in Europe and the Middle East, touching upon global studies and exploring concepts of administration that pertain to religious diversity, minority politics, local sovereignty, centralization, and federalism, all the way from the late Ottoman Empire to the European Union. She will say a few words and serve as the moderator of this panel. Our next panelist, Karen Delaney, represents the Advocacy Project. The Advocacy Project was established in 1998 to help marginalized communities and their advocates take action against injustice. Karen's work with the Advocacy Project started in 2015 when she interned as a development assistant. Now her responsibilities include administration, fundraising, and human resources. Karen also coordinates the fellowship program and supervises the interns in the DC office. She graduated from the University of California, Santa Barbara with a bachelor's in global studies and minored in history. Anna Del Petrie is a recent graduate of Princeton Seminary, where she studied theology. Together with Jennifer Castro, she now works as a director of reception and placement at Interfaith Rise, a U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants, refugee resettlement agency in Highland Park, New Jersey. Interfaith Rise has resettled families from Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Iran, Syria, the Congo, Turkey, and others. She is grateful to be here with you today. Sandra Uwiringiyimana, a human rights activist and the author of the memoir How Dare the Sun Rise. She's also the co-founder and director of partnerships and communications at Jimbere Fund, an organization that aims to revitalize distressed communities in the Congo by investing in women. Jimbere Fund provides women from some of the poorest households in Congo's rural communities with training and grants to launch businesses. The organization seeks long-term solutions, working with women to ensure they have every opportunity to succeed and transform their communities for good. Before we hear from our panel, we will hear from Andrew Painter from the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Andrew is a senior policy advisor with the New York office of the UNHCR. Deeply experienced in refugee protection, Andrew has dealt with issues such as detention of asylum seekers, exclusion from refugee status, trafficking and smuggling, protection of unaccompanied and separated children, and comprehensive solutions from a legal, policy, and operational perspective. In 2015, Andrew joined the Executive Office of the Secretary General to support implementation of the Secretary General's Human Rights Upfront initiative. He moved to UNHCR's New York office in early 2016, where he heads its protection and human rights pillar. Andrew received his undergraduate degree from Haverford College, a law degree from New York University School of Law, a master's degree in law and diplomacy from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Please join me in welcoming Andrew to the podium.
Thank you everybody can hear me? Thanks very much for inviting me here for this wonderful event. I love the exhibitions that were outside and seeing all the work that you've been doing. Really great work. Also want to thank Corey for her presentation. Really inspiring hearing the work that you're doing. I know that the UN is trying to do more in terms of its work with youth. The UN is now developing a strategy on youth, and UNHCR is trying to do more as well, so it's great to collaborate with you as we go forward on that. For those of you who don't know UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR was created in 1950, immediately after World War II, by a General Assembly resolution. And we were given a mandate to provide protection to and assistance for refugees, and to find solutions for refugees, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Since 1950, our work has expanded a bit, and we also have a responsibility towards internally displaced persons, especially in the areas of protection and shelter and camp management, and also for stateless persons. And maybe just to do a quick definition check. So a refugee is a person who has crossed the border. There's a main refugee instrument, main refugee convention, the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees, which defines a refugee as a person who has a well-founded fear of persecution on account of one of 5 grounds: political opinion, race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group. And then there are regional instruments that broaden that definition to include people who are fleeing conflict or events seriously disturbing public order. And this all sort of forms the international refugee protection regime, but they have to cross a border. And internally displaced persons are people who are displaced for a variety of reasons, including those who stay within their borders. So just to get that out of the way. I would say that today, displacement and forced displacement is one of the defining humanitarian, development, and political challenges of our time. We are seeing issues and discussions of displacement like we have not before. And part of that is the numbers. The numbers are historically high. 22.5 million refugees, as was said, 43 million IDPs. That's a 50% increase since 2010, 50%. Most of that is due to Syria. More recently, we also now have Bangladesh. So that's a big part of it. Part of it is also where these people were going. Europe saw one of its biggest refugee crises just a few years ago with people entering Europe in 2015. And that also sparked a political dialogue, a political discourse. It's not only an issue of numbers, though. It's also an issue of time. We are seeing refugees who are displaced for years, if not decades. The average length of displacement for refugees, 17 years. For Afghanistan, we're talking about 40 years. For Somalia, we're talking about 27 years. So sometimes people talk about lost generations. We're talking about children, we're talking about youth, we're talking about young people, we're talking about adults who have spent their entire lives as refugees or displaced persons. So UNHCR's responsibility, given to us from our mandate, is to provide protection and assistance to refugees. And many people will have an image of the tents with UNHCR logos or the cars, and that's definitely an important part of the work that we do. and the work that we do with partners, and that's another part. We work very closely with governments, obviously, the host governments, other UN agencies, NGOs, to try and build a comprehensive response. But we also do protection work, and when we talk about protection, we're talking about a lot of the things that we talked about this morning. We're talking about child protection. What happens to that unaccompanied and separated child who arrives, who crosses a border alone? How do you find somebody to take care of him? How do you find a house for her to live in? We're talking about sexual and gender-based violence. We're talking about people with specific needs. The elderly, oftentimes forgotten in a refugee or humanitarian crisis. People with disabilities. This is the kind of protection work that we're talking about. We're talking about education. We're talking about healthcare. The second part of the work that we do, though, is to try and find solutions. And we usually talk about 3 durable solutions. The first one, oftentimes referred to as the ideal one, is people going home. Most refugees want to go home. So how can you ensure that they can go home voluntarily, in safety, and in dignity? And how can we ensure that the conditions that they are going home to are secure enough, are safe enough, that they're not going to be displaced again, or that they're not going to be now internally displaced within their own country? More and more we are seeing refugees who go home and then they end up being internally displaced. And that's not really moving the needle forward in a very good way overall. So we talk about the need today more and more about how do we make a linkage between work with refugees in a humanitarian sense, which is the kind of work that I do, and work with development partners, people who do these 5-year plannings with countries about increasing schools capacity, healthcare facilities, and how do we make sure that people who are coming home from a country of asylum are able to access basic services, because basically what they want their kids to be able to go to school, they want to be able to find a job, and they want to be able to support for their families, they want to live in safety. So it's a range of actors that have to work together on that, including, importantly, development actors. So that's voluntary repatriation. But last year we had maybe 500,000. So we're talking 22 million refugees. We had about 500,000, not a lot. Another area is resettlement, which I know some people here on the panel are involved with, which is where you are moving a refugee from the first country of asylum to another country. And usually those are people who are at risk in their country of asylum. It might be a survivor of torture. It might be somebody who might be targeted. It might be a victim of trauma, female-headed household, medical conditions, a variety of reasons why we say these are people who really should not stay in the first country of asylum, and we should pick that person up and take them somewhere where they can be treated and taken care of and be safe. Those numbers are not very big either, less than 1%, and the numbers are getting smaller. The last solution is what we call local integration, which is how can we take care of people where they are? How can we ensure that in their country of asylum they have access to healthcare, they have access to education, they can rebuild their lives? Even the word local integration, though, can be very political. It can be very controversial with a lot of host states who see a refugee influx and they say, how is that going to impact my economy? How is that going to impact the racial balance in my country? What's the impact going to be in terms of my politics, even? How's my relationship with my local communities going to be affected by this? So we have to try and find a way of working with governments to provide the services and hopefully move towards, and some countries have taken on a concept of local integration, of saying these are people who are now part of our communities. And we're going to try and make a way, find a way for them to be integrated fully. And that means socioeconomically access to services, and ideally even legally, giving them access to permanent residence, if not a nationality. So that's the kind of work that UNHCR is doing globally. And throughout all of this work, gender equality and empowerment of women is a central part. Why? Because, as was mentioned, over 50% of refugees are women and girls. And we know that the impact of conflict and displacement on women and girls can be particularly profound. And here I'll give some statistics. Humanitarian context. Average of 70% of women experience some form of sexual and gender-based violence. 70%. And we're talking then in the country of origin. We're talking about while in flight, issues, smugglers, trafficking, not uncommon in situations of displacement. And we're talking about in countries of refuge and countries of asylum. Adolescent girls in conflict zones, almost twice as likely to be out of school when compared to girls in conflict-free countries. And that's in a situation where we already have issues about enrollment and attendance of girls in general being lower than for boys. Child marriage rates soar in situations of conflict and displacement. In Syria, the child marriage rate is 4 times higher than it was before the conflict took place. So any refugee response that's being developed has to address these risks. But it also has to look at women and girls not, and I think somebody else mentioned this, not just as victims. I think you mentioned this in terms of youth. Not just as victims, but as drivers of change, as agents of change. And we have to think, how can we empower women to be active members of their community? Because they are going to, we already know, they will make choices and they will make decisions, especially for their households, for their communities, that will be better for their children and will be better for their families in many situations. One area that I'd like to talk about a little bit, was mentioned earlier, is the Global Compact on Refugees, which is a global initiative that is underway right now, which will hopefully have an impact on the ground. The Global Compact on Refugees is now being developed in Geneva, and it came out of something called the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants, which was adopted by the General Assembly in September of 2016. And that was a very significant achievement, the New York Declaration, because what happened was you had 193 member states, the General Assembly, at the head of state level, so very high level, at a time that, it'd be generous to say, was not very friendly towards refugees and migrants. You know, we are very much living today in a world of xenophobia, of a lot of speech directed against refugees and migrants. And in this context, we had member states who declared solidarity with people who were forced to flee and with migrants, who reaffirmed the importance of the International Refugee Protection Regime, those conventions that I mentioned, and the obligations on states that are within those conventions. Importantly, acknowledged that the protection of refugees and support to the host communities is a shared responsibility. And I'll come back to that. It's not just the responsibility of that receiving state, but it's a responsibility for the entire international community to support these individuals and find solutions for them. And that has been a controversial issue. It committed to expand solutions, those 3 solutions I mentioned, and others, for those who are displaced. And it established a framework for comprehensive and predictable responses to large refugee movements. And that's been called the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework, the CRRF. We can certainly talk about that more during the Q&A, but that's now being piloted out in a number of countries. Now, gender equality was a very important component of the New York Declaration, with member states committing that in any refugee response, they were going to do at least 3 things. They were going to maintain a gender perspective throughout that response. They were going to promote gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls. And they were going to fully respect the human rights of women and girls. So we have these commitments, and they made a number of other commitments as well in different areas, in different sectors. Now, so this New York Declaration was adopted, lots of fanfare, good news, and then the question is, all right, well, now what? And what that New York Declaration did is it gave rise to 2 separate compacts. A global compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration, and a global compact on refugees. Because the New York Declaration addressed both groups. There's no universal definition of a migrant. There's one for statistical purposes, but a migrant generally is moving for reasons unrelated to persecution, armed conflict back home. Oftentimes for reasons of employment or bettering their situation for their families, but also a variety of other reasons. Slow onset climate change is another reason. Some would say because of poor living conditions. But there are two compacts that were launched in September 2016. The Global Compact on Migration is now being negotiated in a very traditional, formal, intergovernmental process in New York. And the Global Compact on Refugees is being developed in Geneva, led by UNHCR, with formal consultations by states. And we can talk about the processes if you'd like later as well. But the Global Compact on Refugees, the approach that's been taken on that is, let us take those commitments in the New York Declaration and let's figure out how do we make those a reality? How do we operationalize those commitments? Let's draw from the lessons that are out there, the lessons that are being learned in these CRRF pilot countries and other places as well. And let's also establish mechanisms for responsibility sharing that can make those commitments a reality. Because an overarching objective of the Global Compact on Refugees is to improve and to ensure what we call responsibility sharing. When I said back before in the New York Declaration that there was an acknowledgement that it's a shared responsibility to take care of these people, that's what this Global Compact is trying to do. How do we make that a reality? Because when we talk about normative standards, there's a refugee protection regime that's out there that's been built up for 70 years, since 1950 and the 1951 Convention. There are standards, there are laws, there are principles that are in place. The big gap that has always been there is responsibility sharing. And when host states receive a big group of refugees and they say, help, we need help, is there some way that they can be assured that other states will provide the assistance that they need? 86% of refugees live in the developing world. 86% are living in countries that are already struggling themselves to take care of their own citizens in terms of services, infrastructure, etc. And they're now taking care of an additional influx of refugees. The number of resettlement countries is very small. The number of donors is very small. How do we grow that pool of member states? How do we grow that pool of other actors, be it certainly refugees and host communities, community service organizations, other member states, local authorities, etc. And again, like the New York Declaration, gender equality runs throughout the Global Compact on Refugees, with the idea, again, of how do we make it a reality, and how do we support states. So we're not trying through the Global Compact to create new standards, new norms. We're trying to figure out what needs to happen to provide the support that's needed to host states to make those reality. So it calls for contributions to promote meaningful participation and leadership of women and girls. It calls for building the capacity of women's organizations. Those could be national organizations, local organizations, and also building the capacities of government ministries that have a responsibility for gender affairs or women affairs. Strengthening the safety and the security of women and girls, including prevention and response to SGBV, sexual and gender-based violence. Facilitating access to gender-responsive services and strengthening the agency of women and girls, importantly through livelihoods, importantly through education. So what does that mean? We say that, what does that mean? All right, let's unpack that in a few different examples. So when we talk about women's and girls' equal and meaningful participation, let's look at some good examples that are out there. In Cameroon, UNHCR, for example, providing leadership training that targets women, focuses on livelihoods and community empowerment. In Turkey, supporting a women's network that gives women a space where they can support each other, exchange information, discuss common challenges. Very important. Women and girls' economic empowerment. In Chad and Jordan, offering childcare services to to women so that they can then pursue livelihoods opportunities. This is especially important to female-headed households. If I got to take care of my children, how am I actually supposed to get training? How am I supposed to get a job? In Uganda, providing startup kits to women and children, not children, like seeds and farming tools. Prevention and response to SGBV. In Turkey, the ministry involved with gender affairs has been making a big push to make sure that foreign women get access to women's shelters in the country. In Afghanistan, UNHCR and a partner organization, we opened a female-only internet cafe. Because women were saying, when I go to these mixed gender internet cafes, I'm being harassed, I'm being threatened. So, cafe has 25 laptops. Women and girls who are in university or in high school are able to go there, work on their assignments, and they're also able to have access to SGBV counseling and referrals if they need it. So these kinds of examples, they're not, some of them are common sense almost, but they're very real. They're very real for the people who are able to access. It's very real for the young woman who's able to go and do a university assignment in a cafe where she doesn't feel threatened, she doesn't feel safe. So with the Global Compact, it's trying to grab some of these ideas and say, all right, who can help us develop these? Who can help us build these up, scale these up, reproduce these, and help that host government to provide the kind of protection and assistance that's needed? And I think we're gonna get there. There are a number of member states that are strongly committed to gender equality, empowerment of women, who are pushing quite hard to say, we want to make sure this is a very strong element of that Global Compact. So watch this space. The Global Compact is going to be negotiated over for the next, until the end of July. We're meeting once a month in Geneva. The High Commissioner includes the proposed Global Compact in his annual report to the General Assembly. He's going to present it in November, and hopefully it will be adopted in December, and then we'll take it from there. But so, like I said, watch that space, keep an eye on it, and contribute where you can. We can talk about that too. Thank you very much.
All right, we now turn the floor over to Dr. Christopoulou.